Ferdinand Schörner is not a name that appears in most histories of the Second World War, and that absence is itself a kind of judgment, because the men who shaped the war in its final desperate months were often the men that subsequent generations found most difficult to look at directly, and Schörner is one of those men, a general who rose to the highest rank in the German army, not despite his brutality, but because of it, a man whose soldiers feared him more than they feared the enemy, a man who hanged his own troops for retreating, and then fled by private plane when the end finally came. And his story is the story of what happens when a military system rewards savagery and calls it leadership. Ferdinand Schörner was born in June 1892 in Munich, the son of a police officer, and his background was solidly middle class in the way that produced many of the German officer corps of his generation. Not aristocratic enough for the old Prussian military establishment, but ambitious enough to climb through the ranks on talent and aggression. And Schörner had both in abundance, and he had something else as well, a physical courage that was genuinely extraordinary and that earned him the Pour le Mérite, the highest military decoration of the Imperial German Army in the First World War, and this decoration, known as the Blue Max, was worn by fewer than 700 men in the entire war, and the fact that Schörner was one of them tells you something important about who he was and what he was capable of. Because whatever else you say about Ferdinand Schörner, and there is a great deal to say, he was never a coward in the face of the enemy. The First World War shaped Schörner in the way that it shaped an entire generation of German officers, with a combination of genuine military experience and the sense of betrayal that came with defeat. And like many of his generation, he found in the Nazi movement an answer to the questions that defeat had raised, not immediately and not completely, but gradually and then completely. And by the time Hitler came to power in 1933, Schörner was already moving in the direction of a military career that would be defined as much by political loyalty as by professional competence. And the two things were not always in tension, because in the German army of the Third Reich, political loyalty and professional advancement were deeply intertwined in ways that shaped everything that followed. Through the 1930s, Schörner advanced steadily through the ranks, and the early years of the war gave him the opportunity to demonstrate the qualities that would eventually carry him to the top: aggressive leadership, physical presence at the front, an instinct for the kind of attack that disrupted enemy formations before they could consolidate, and a complete indifference to casualties that his superiors found useful and his subordinates found terrifying. And by the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Schörner was already marked as one of the more promising commanders in the German army, a man who could be trusted to push forward, regardless of circumstances and regardless of cost. The Eastern Front was where Schörner became what he ultimately was, because the Eastern Front was a war of a different kind from anything that had come before. A war without limits or rules. A war where the ideological framework of Nazism had stripped away the last restraints that professional military culture might otherwise have imposed, and Schörner thrived in this environment in the way that certain kinds of personalities thrive when all the normal constraints are removed, and his reputation as a commander who got results through fear and violence grew alongside his reputation as a commander who got results on the battlefield and in the German army of 1942 and 1943. These were not separate reputations, but the same reputation described from different angles. The specific practices that made Schörner's name synonymous with terror among his own troops developed gradually and then became systematic, and they centered on his use of courts martial and summary execution as tools of battlefield discipline, because Schörner believed, or at least acted as though he believed, that the primary reason German soldiers failed in battle was not material inferiority or exhaustion, or the overwhelming weight of Soviet numbers, but moral weakness, cowardice, a failure of will that could be corrected by making the consequences of that failure more immediate and more certain than the consequences of facing the enemy. And this belief, whether genuine or cynical, produced a command style that his soldiers described in terms that sound less like military leadership and more like a reign of terror. The flying courts martial that Schörner established in the final years of the war were one of the most feared instruments of his command, because these were not deliberative bodies that weighed evidence and applied legal standards, but rapid judgment mechanisms designed to process soldiers accused of unauthorized retreat or abandonment of position and produce verdicts quickly enough to serve as examples to other soldiers who might be contemplating the same thing, and the verdicts were almost invariably the same: death by hanging, and the bodies were left where others could see them, and around the necks of the hanged men were placed signs that explained their offense: coward, deserter, traitor, and these signs were as much a part of the punishment as the hanging itself, because they were directed not at the dead man, but at every living soldier who passed that way. The numbers involved in Schörner's judicial terror are difficult to establish with precision, because the records of summary courts martial in the chaos of the war's final months are incomplete, and because the German military justice system in this period was itself a kind of controlled chaos, in which the distinction between legal execution and simple murder had become almost meaningless. But the estimates that historians have produced suggest that hundreds of German soldiers were executed under Schörner's command for offenses that in any other army at any other time would have resulted in disciplinary action at most. And the soldiers who served under him and survived described a command climate in which the fear of their own general was a constant presence that competed with and sometimes exceeded the fear of the enemy. The specific cases that have been documented are themselves a window into the psychology of Schörner's command, because they reveal a man who used judicial execution not just as a tool of discipline, but as a performance of power, a demonstration that he, and he alone, controlled the fate of every man under his command, and the targets of this performance were not always the men who had actually committed the offenses for which they were punished, because there are documented cases in which soldiers were hanged for retreating when the retreat had been ordered by their immediate superior. And there are cases in which men were executed for abandoning equipment that had been destroyed by enemy fire before they could save it. And in each of these cases, the point was not justice, but terror, not the correction of genuine failures, but the demonstration that failure of any kind would be punished without mercy. By 1944, Schörner had risen to command Army Group South Ukraine, and then Army Group Center, and then Army Group A, and his promotions came directly from Hitler, who found in Schörner exactly the kind of commander that the situation seemed to demand, a man who would not retreat, who would not surrender, who would fight to the last man and the last bullet, regardless of tactical sense or strategic reality. And Hitler's confidence in Schörner was one of the more revealing aspects of Hitler's own psychology in the final years of the war, because what Hitler valued in Schörner was not military judgment, but will, not the ability to assess a situation and respond to it rationally, but the ability to impose his own determination on a situation, regardless of what the situation itself demanded. The promotions that Schörner received in the war's final phase were the product of this confidence, and they came at a pace that reflected the desperation of Germany's strategic situation, because the men who were being promoted to command army groups in 1944 and 1945 were being promoted into positions of command over formations that were being destroyed faster than they could be reconstituted. And the job of commanding an army group on the Eastern Front in this period was essentially the job of managing a catastrophic defeat in a way that extracted maximum cost from the enemy while minimizing the speed of the collapse. And Schörner was Hitler's preferred instrument for this task because he could be trusted to keep fighting regardless of circumstances. In January 1945, the Soviet winter offensive shattered the German front in the east with a force and on a scale that made everything that had come before seem like a preliminary, and the army group that Schörner commanded was caught in the maelstrom of this offensive and suffered losses that destroyed any remaining possibility of effective resistance. And in the chaos of this collapse, the flying courts-martial continued their work, and soldiers who had been overrun and separated from their units by Soviet tank formations were hanged for desertion, and men who had retreated in the face of attacks that no military force could have withstood were hanged for cowardice, and the signs around their necks continued to explain their offenses to the soldiers who passed their bodies on the roads leading west. In April 1945, with Germany collapsing on every front and Berlin surrounded and Hitler in his bunker counting the days, Schörner received his final and most extraordinary promotion because on April 5, 1945, less than 5 weeks before the German surrender, Adolf Hitler signed the order promoting Ferdinand Schörner to General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. And this promotion was not based on any military achievement because there were no military achievements left to be had. It was a political act, a reward for loyalty and for the willingness to keep fighting when every rational assessment of the situation argued for surrender. And it made Schörner the last field marshal created by the Third Reich, a distinction that carried with it all the weight of what the Third Reich had become by April 1945. 5 days later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker, and in his political testament he named Schörner as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, the last holder of that office in the history of the Third Reich. And this appointment was as much a fantasy as everything else in Hitler's final days, because the army of which Schörner was now nominally the supreme commander was in the process of disintegrating, and the men Schörner had spent years terrorizing into fighting were now surrendering by the hundreds of thousands to any Allied force they could reach. And here is where the story of Ferdinand Schörner reaches its most revealing and most contemptible moment, because on May 8, 1945, the day of the German surrender, with his troops still fighting and dying in Czechoslovakia, with soldiers who had served under his command still facing Soviet forces in the last hours of a war that was already officially over, Schörner boarded a private plane in civilian clothes and flew to Austria and surrendered to American forces. And the contrast between this act and everything he had demanded of his soldiers for the previous 3 years could not have been more complete or more damning, because the man who had hanged soldiers for unauthorized retreat made his own unauthorized retreat by air while his army collapsed around him, and the man who had placed signs around the necks of hanged soldiers explaining their cowardice chose to abandon his command rather than share their fate. The soldiers he left behind paid a terrible price for his abandonment, because the fighting in Czechoslovakia continued for days after the official surrender, as Soviet forces pursued and destroyed German units that had not received or had not accepted the surrender order. And men died in those final days who might have lived if their commanding general had managed the surrender of his forces with the same energy he had devoted to managing their terror. And the bitter irony that the man most responsible for prolonging their ordeal had escaped it by private plane was not lost on the survivors. Schörner was captured by American forces in Austria, but was handed over to the Soviet Union, which had its own reasons for wanting to try the man who had commanded against them in the final desperate months of the war. And the Soviets tried him in 1952 on charges of war crimes and sentenced him to 25 years imprisonment, and he served 6 years before being released as part of a broader agreement between West Germany and the Soviet Union regarding German prisoners of war. And he returned to West Germany in 1955, where he expected to receive the kind of welcome that other returning prisoners of war received. He did not receive that welcome because the men who had served under him had not forgotten what he had done to them, and the veterans' organizations that might otherwise have supported him were full of men whose comrades had been hanged on Schörner's orders, and the German legal system, still working through the enormous backlog of cases arising from the war's final chaos, took an interest in the cases that had been raised against him. And in 1957, a West German court tried Schörner for the manslaughter of German soldiers under his command and convicted him and sentenced him to 4.5 years imprisonment, making him one of the very few German commanders to be tried and convicted by a German court for crimes against German soldiers rather than against the enemy. He served that sentence and was released in 1963, and he lived in Munich until his death in 1973. And the world paid very little attention to his passing, because by 1973, the story of Ferdinand Schörner had been absorbed into the larger story of what Germany had done to itself and to others in the 12 years of the Third Reich. And the specific horror of what he had done to his own soldiers had been subsumed into the general horror of everything else. And the last Field Marshal of the Third Reich died in the same city where he had been born 80 years earlier, and the soldiers he had hanged did not.